Well, the Apostle Peter wrote that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. And an accountant heard that verse, and they heard that verse, and they were just completely amazed. Lord, is it true? They were asking the Lord, is it true that 1,000 years for us is like a day to you? This is a true story. And 1,000 years for us is just like a day to you. And the Lord replied, yes, it is. And the accountant was like, well, then that must mean like $1 million is like a penny to you. And the Lord responded, yes, it is. Well, Lord, would you be willing to give me one of those pennies? And the Lord replied, okay, yeah, absolutely. Just wait here a day. Some of you got it, right? A day is as 1,000 years. Okay. Sometimes waiting is hard, right? If the Lord tells you to wait, no one likes to wait, but we wait all the time. We wait in traffic. We wait in carpool lanes. We wait in holding patterns. We wait in the grocery stores. We wait for the doctor. We sometimes wait for the spouse. We wait for a baby or for retirement. Some of us are waiting for the sermon to be over already. Waiting is not just something that we do. It is something, I will say, that we as believers get to do, spiritually speaking, because waiting is the process of becoming more of what the Lord wants us to be. And it's sometimes in that waiting that we have a tendency to question, where is God in the midst of this? Sometimes in waiting for an answer, waiting for something to take place in our life, something to happen, we start to maybe question, Lord, where are you in this? And sometimes in the waiting, it seems as if God is silent. And so in those moments of waiting, do we sit back and relax? Do we wait? Do we work? Do we get angry at the Lord in those waitings? Do we get bitter? Do we take matters into our own hands? Micah 7:7 says, but as for me, I watch and hope for the Lord, and I wait for my God, my Savior. And this morning in Esther chapter 5, we will see really Esther having set a time aside of waiting to hear from the Lord, then finally bring her plan, the plan that I believe she received from the Lord, into action to address the king. And so if you're taking notes this morning, I've titled this morning's message, Weight Watchers. W-A-I-T, Weight Watchers. Not the food, but just in waiting and watching. And we're going to be looking at 5 points and then drawing some application at the end. We're going to look at verse 1 and seeing that Esther was fearless. We'll look at verse 2 through 3 where we'll see she will find favor in the eyes of the king. Verse 4 through 8, we'll see a series of feasts that the king will throw. Verse 9 through 13, we'll see Haman have some fury in his life. And then verse 14, some fatal advice that Haman will receive. And now, if this is your first time or you haven't been with us in a while, I always like to recap where we've been. And we're in a series that we've titled, When God Seems Absent. And the main reasoning behind that is because in the book of Esther, it doesn't ever mention God. The word Yahweh isn't mentioned. There is no Mosaic law, no sacrifices, no mention specifically of prayer. Today we'll look at fasting, but there's no mention of prayer. It's one of the only books that in the Old Testament that's not found in the New Testament. It's not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And yet, in the midst of this book, we see God working and moving in the background, setting up things, putting things into place, setting things into motion so that he ultimately receives the glory in what we as believers call providence. It's the Latin phrase providentia, where we get the word modern day word video from, where it's really to see something or to watch something as it's taking place, or to be able to rewind the tape and see what's happening. And really, for us as believers, we don't believe in coincidence or happenstance or dumb luck. We believe in providence, that God is working, God is moving, that no matter the things that take place in our life, God is there, he's leading, he's guiding, and he sets things into motion. Psalm 37 verse 23 says, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in them. And so there are times in our lives when we we'll look and it seems as if God is absent. It seems as if God is not working. God is not moving. He's not there. Where is he in the midst of this? And yet he is there. He is invisible, but he's never indifferent. And though there are times where he is silent, he is never absent. And he's always working, like Esther. From the Middle East to Highlands Ranch, from the Palace of Susa to Denver, Colorado. And Chuck Swindoll said this about the book of Esther. He said, God's presence is not as intriguing as his absence is in this book. His voice is not as eloquent as his silence. Who of us has not longed for a word from God, searched for a glimpse of his power, and yearned for the reassurance of his presence, only to feel that he seems absent for the moment, distant or maybe preoccupied, maybe even unconcerned, and yet later on in life we realize how very present he was along the way. In Esther, we see God working. The book of Esther is just some basic information. It's a narrative, which means it's written in novel form. It's written to be read like a story. And we don't know exactly who the author is. Some people might say Ezra is the author, but there's a lot of kind of debate back and forth that maybe Nehemiah was the author. Nehemiah is the writer of the book of Nehemiah, and when you read Nehemiah and you read the book of Esther, they really kind of line up together. And I'll say this just as a side note, just take this as a grain of salt, just kind of an interesting kind of side thought line. Nehemiah served under a king by the name of Artaxerxes. His father, Xerxes, is the king we're talking about in the book of Esther. And if Xerxes and Esther, being the queen, have a child, it could be that Artaxerxes was that child. And if Artaxerxes is that child, he allows Nehemiah to go rebuild the walls. He fully funds the project, uses the cedars of Lebanon, everything that he had in his power, sends him with a governor's note and a military background and security and protection and everything like that. And I just wondering, hey, if he's so kind to Nehemiah, maybe it's because he had a soft side towards the Jews, a heart towards the Jews, maybe because his mom was, just a side note. But a lot of scholars and experts believe that maybe Nehemiah wrote the book. And the story is of a young queen who will stand up for her people. And last week we saw her do that. Her cousin who had adopted her and raised her as his own because she was an orphan child, what we see is he rises to the scene and really challenges Esther last week to do something because there's an edict given to destroy all of the Jews by this wicked, crazy guy by the name of Haman. And he tells her, maybe you've been destined for such a time as this. And so Esther thinks about it and says, hey, how can I go before the king? I haven't been called to him for 30 days. It's been almost a whole month since I've seen him. And then she realizes, you know what? Someone's got to stand in the gap. Someone's got to be a mediator for her people. And she uses those fatal words, if I perish, I perish. So be it. Kill me now. I'll go ahead and do the things that are required of me to stand in the gap for my people. And that's really where we pick up today in chapter 5, where we see Esther really wait some time and then put that plan into motion, into action. So if you'll notice with me our first point, fearless, chapter 5, verse 1. Now it happened on the third day. So it's been 3 days since the word from Mordecai came for Esther to go before the king for such a time as this. And she says, I'll do it. If I perish, I perish. She had asked them to fast for them. There's no word or mention of prayer, but when you think of fasting and prayer usually coincide together. And so she asks them to fast. And so it's been 3 days that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. It tells us that Esther really, for all intents and purposes, takes her life into her own hands. She risks her life She puts on her royal robe and stands in the inner court of the king's palace. And really, by doing this, she's showing great courage in her willingness to appear before the king without being summoned by him. You see, Persian customs in that day was that you could not enter into the king's presence unless you had been called by the king. And as we saw last week, it's been 30 days for her. She hasn't seen her husband in 30 days. He's been in his man cave hanging out by himself. And she's been wondering, where is he? Where is he? And he hasn't called her for 30 days. Mordecai had told her previously that she's got to try to reach him. And Esther tells them last week to fast for 3 days. Now, like I mentioned, there's no mention of prayer in this book, but fasting usually includes prayer. And so I would say it's safe to assume that as she had asked the people to fast for her for 3 days, they most likely were praying for her for 3 days. And Esther was with all of her maidens. They're fasting. Her maidens were probably Jewish maybe, but we know that Xerxes, the king, had a harem. And her being the queen, the head of the harem, she could dictate and decree whatever she wanted to these ladies. And so maybe she ordered them to fast as well. And so remember, the king doesn't have any idea that Esther is Jewish. Haman, the bad guy in the story, the evil man, the Hitler of his day who's bent on Holocaust and destruction of the Jews, doesn't know that she is Jewish. And so Esther and her crew, Mordecai and the people are all fasting and praying. So for her to go before the king now is a big deal because King Xerxes doesn't have a good reputation of how he deals with his wives or his queens. If you remember in chapter 1, his Queen Vashti, he had ordered her to come in and with all of his drinking buddies to dance or to be naked just in her royal crown before all of his friends, and she refused, and so she was deposed. He got rid of her. So he doesn't have a good record of dealing with his wives and queens. On top of that, the Persian custom was to not go before the king. Actually, archaeological evidence shows that her trepidation maybe, or her, I want to say, taking the risk was a big deal because 2 sculptures have been excavated in Persepolis showing the Persian king seated on a throne with a long scepter in his hand. And to the right of him is an attendant, a Median soldier holding a large axe, which Persian custom was if you entered before the king and he doesn't extend his scepter to you, well, that right-hand attendant will off with their head, basically. So she was taking a major risk going before the king. Yes, it's her husband, but still, he's the all-powerful Xerxes, the king of a Persian empire, modern-day Iran. And Esther puts on her royal robe. She claims her true identity as the queen, and I would say as a fearless woman of God, and she goes to the court. This is courage. This is great courage to do what is right and what is good and what is honorable, no matter the consequence. It's what the great theologian John Wayne said. Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. And that really is the thought line. Here's Esther, saddling up anyway. Like she said last week, if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die, but I'm going to stand in the gap for the Jewish people. Notice our next point. She ends up finding favor in the eyes of the king. Verse 2, so it was that when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. And then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What do you request? It shall be given to you up to half of the kingdom. Esther has been waiting 3 days to approach the king. 3 days. If you want, in between chapter 4 and chapter 5, there might be a little bit of a white space in your Bible. You can pause and write in there was no action, just a lot of prayer. Because that's really what she's been doing. Chuck Swindoll called those 3 days a silent but powerful parenthesis in Esther's life. Esther only had to wait 3 days, but for each and every single one of us, there have been moments in our lives where we've had to wait. For some of us, it's 3 days. For some of us, we're waiting for that phone call from someone. For some of us, we're waiting 9 months for that baby to come. For some of us, we wait for retirement, or we're looking forward towards that, the empty nester moments. But for all intents and purposes, Esther didn't just sit back and do nothing during those 3 days. She fasted, and I believe she planned. Now, it's obvious here that in that time of fasting, presumably prayer was taking place, but it resulted in a few things for Esther. Number one, I believe she had a plan, a specific plan that maybe God had given her. Much like Nehemiah. If you remember, Nehemiah hears that the walls of Jerusalem have been destroyed, and he begins to fast and he begins to pray, and he comes up with a specific plan so that when King Xerxes, the guy we're talking about here, his son, goes to Nehemiah and says, hey, why so sad? Why so bummed out? It says that Nehemiah prayed, and then he answered the king. But he didn't just answer the king and say, oh, I'm totally bummed out because my hometown is destroyed. No, he said, my hometown is destroyed. Now, king, if it would be your will, let me go and rebuild the walls. On top of that, I would like for you to fully fund the project. He had a plan. And King Xerxes says, yeah, I'll fully fund the project. I'll let that happen. I believe during that time of prayer and fasting, God gave him a plan. Here, God, I believe, gave Queen Esther a plan. Here's what's interesting is he asks her the question, Queen Esther, what do you want? I'll give you up to half of my kingdom. And she could have easily jumped and said, I want Haman dead. Or I want your decree about the Jews to die in 9 months. I want that to be terminated. I want that to be over. But she doesn't ask any of those things. Why? Well, she understands the process, and she understands the times, and she understands the situation, and has a plan to take care of it. You see, the Persian king, once a Persian king made an edict and a decree, there's no way to go back on it. If you were with us when we went through the book of Daniel, it was the same with King Nebuchadnezzar and the decrees that he had made regarding Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because they refused to bow down, they had to ultimately go into the furnace, go into the fire, because the king's command, the decree, was written in stone. Probably literally, it was written in stone. So there was no way to go back on this. So she knew that he couldn't go back on his word. So she doesn't ask him to remove the decree or to go back on his word. So she's being wise, I think, and she realizes that there's a sense of timing involved here. It gives her some time to also plan the banquet that we'll see here in a sec that she invites Haman to. It reminds me of Proverbs 21, verse 1, that the king's heart is in the hands of the Lord. Like the rivers of water, he turns it whichever way he wants. And so here's Esther, received by the king on the 3rd day, and she didn't just wait and do nothing. Sometimes we view waiting like, oh, I'm just waiting in line at Disneyland. I'm just waiting for this ride to come. Or no, but instead it's like a faithful promise of a loving father who says to the child, tomorrow we're going to Disneyland, but today we have to wait. Isaiah 40, verse 31 says, those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And so here she is, waiting, planning, and then she's about to take action. The hard part about the Christian life is waiting is par and course with the Christian life. You see, the moment we get saved, we're justified instantaneously. The moment we die, we're glorified. We go to heaven to be with the Lord. But in the middle is this process called sanctification. And it's a long, drawn-out process, where we wait, we learn, we grow. And the reality is the majority of us probably hate waiting. I don't know about you, but I hate waiting. I hate it. I don't like if I call Comcast or something and I have to be put on hold, and they play this classical music because they say that type of music's supposed to soothe the savage beast. But the reality is it just makes me more angry. I'm like, if I have to listen to Beethoven one more time, I'm going to freak out because I've been waiting and waiting and waiting. I don't know anybody that likes to wait. Remember, we used to have 1 hour photo. Remember that? They had those Fox, I think it were Fox stands in the middle of mall parking lots. Back to the Future, if you remember Back to the Future, that's standing there when they take off in the DeLorean and just, okay. Well, now 1 hour photo's too slow for us. We don't like to wait. And I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to you that you don't like to wait. Because some of you are like, no, Pastor Fern, I'm an angel and I love to wait. When you go to the grocery store and there's only 2 checkout stands open, which one do you pick? The one that has the longer line or the shorter line? The shorter line, right? Because you're not a crazy person, okay? The shorter line. But here's what happens. What if they're both equal? If they're both equal, what you do is you pick the one that you think has the best odds of winning. That's usually what you do. And you look at everyone's cart, and you go, okay, I'm going to pick this one. And then what you do, because you don't like to wait, is you then watch the other line to see where you would be in that line to see if you would make it through, right? And so you watch it, and that line starts to move quick, and you're like, oh, I should have picked that line. And then it slows down, and then you start making your way quicker, and there's one person in front of you. There's 3 people where you would be in that line. And you're like, all right, I made the good choice. And then the person in front of you pulls out a checkbook and coupons, and you're like, what is going on? Why? Because we hate waiting. We hate it. But yet, for the Christian, waiting, learning, growing is par and course with the Christian life. I've used this illustration before, but it's like geology. If you took geology in high school or in college, the thought line of geology is really the study of pressure and time. Pressure and time. And what happens over the course, if you were to take, for example, a piece of coal and you apply pressure and time to that, you end up getting a diamond. They're both made of carbon. They're both made of the exact same thing, but the difference is one has been placed under pressure and time. And so many times for us, when pressure and the waiting takes place in our lives, when there's trials and we have to wait for something, or we're not hearing from the Lord, or we don't hear Him verbally or audibly, we're not hearing Him in our prayers. We feel like He's absent, indifferent. He's not there. He doesn't care about me or anything like that. And in those moments of trials and time and pressure and waiting, what God is doing is He's working something beautiful in us to mold us and shape us, to sanctify us, to make us more like Him, to grow us in our walk with Him. But what happens to a piece of coal when you take it out of the ground early? Nothing. It stays black and bitter, and it's just a piece of coal. You've got to stay in the ground and allow the pressure and time to work and build in order to become the diamond that God wants you to be. And so as we're waiting, as we're learning, as we're growing, God is doing something in our lives in those times. And throughout the Bible, we see different people waiting. James 1 says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, but let that patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. So when you look at God's word throughout all of Scripture, there are people that have to wait. They have to go endure the trials. They have to go through those things in order for God to use them in amazing ways. So Job. Job lost his family. He lost his kids. He lost his camels and his sheep and his oxen and just everything. The only thing left is his wife, and his wife comes to him and says, curse God and die. Thanks for the encouragement, honey, His friends are sitting around the fire with him, and they look at him like, Job, what'd you do wrong, man? Why'd you make God angry? He's like, I didn't do anything wrong. And yet he goes through these trials before God will then bless him doubly. Doubly, is that even a word? Doubly? I'm just making up words. David and the Psalms. I mean, just think of all the Psalms that David wrote and all the Psalms that we enjoy reading. All because his father-in-law was trying to kill him in the desert. Moses, you're going to be a great leader. You're going to do great and powerful things for me. But first, you're going to spend 40 years in the desert. 40 years. And some of us can't wait 3 hours, 3 days, 40 years. Joseph, you're going to be second in command of all of Egypt. You're going to ride around on Air Chariot 2, okay? You're going to wear the eyeliner and walk like an Egyptian and do great and amazing things to save your people, but first you're going to go to prison and be falsely accused. See, those moments of pressure in time, those moments of waiting and trials, God does something. They're essential to the Christian walk. The very understanding of the Christian walk is par and course with these things. And sometimes God has to get us to a place where that waiting and learning and growing or developing a plan like Esther here before action can happen in order to change us, in order to grow us, in order to make us a diamond, in order to purify us. Waiting changes us. Waiting brings about some new things. It brings us new strength. It brings us new perspective. It can bring us new energy to run the race. It can bring us a new determination to push on. And so what happens while we wait? Well, it allows God to work in our hearts, to trust him, in our lives, so that even our enemies or those that hate us will fear the Lord maybe because of what he is doing in and through us. It allows God to work in our circumstances themselves. Sometimes some things just need to be played out before any action takes place. And so here's Esther. She's waited 3 days. She's fasted, and I believe prayed. She's also, during this time, I think, developed a plan because she doesn't just go hastily to the king and he's like, what do you want? Up to half of my kingdom. I want that guy dead. I want you to return. No, she realizes that there's a sense of timing in this. And here he extends the scepter. I tried to do this with my wife. She didn't like it too much. I was like, honey, whenever you come into the room, you've got to touch the golden remote. She was like, no, not happening. And the king says, what do you wish? I mean, she could have come in with attitude. Let me tell you what I want. No. She could have said, Haman. She could have played the king's emotions. Well, king, I'm your favorite wife. No. She could have gotten anxious. No, she's prayed, fasted, stuck to the plan. And notice what happens, verse 4 through 8. So a series of feasts takes place. So Esther answered, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared, and the banquet of wine with the king. At the banquet of wine with the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half of the kingdom, it shall be done. And then Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said. What is she doing while she's fasting and praying? She's planning a feast. That's what she's doing. And it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever fasted and had to cook a meal. It's the worst. I'm just letting you know. It's so difficult because you're fasting praying to the Lord, seeking the Lord, and at the same time you have to like whip up this macaroni and cheese for your kiddos, and the fumes are just going up into your nostrils, and it's like, oh, this is the best food ever, even though you hate mac and cheese. And so it's just crazy, like the things you're willing to eat. I would eat just ketchup potato chips right now if I could, and those are the worst things ever. I'm just letting you guys know that now. But when you're fasting, they sound like the best thing ever. That was weird. Side note, okay. And so she's planning this feast. Ecclesiastes 7:2 says, what did Solomon mean by this? He says this, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. What's going on is she understands that really in trying to get the attention of the king, that working it through food and talking to him over a meal is going to help the situation. Why didn't she say something at the first feast? Well, I believe it's because she sensed the timing, and the Lord had given her an awareness and a sensitivity that maybe that just wasn't the right moment to do it. So she asks again for a second feast. And he says, up to half of the kingdom. She says, listen, why don't you guys come back tomorrow? Let's do something tomorrow. Let's have another feast with Haman. Sometimes we need to wait before jumping right into things. To discern the Lord's timing. So before you say yes to something, you got to think it through. Before you say yes to an event, or yes to that person, or yes to committing to something, think it through. Look through it. Maybe the timing isn't right, because for Esther, this feast, the timing isn't right. For Esther, whatever it was, the Lord, fear, it definitely raises, I think, the tension in the level of the story, because she had invited them to this feast. They're having the feast. He says, hey, what do you want? Up to half of the kingdom. And she could have made her request then, but she doesn't, and says, hey, why don't you come back tomorrow? Let's have another feast. You and Haman, let's get together again. And notice our next point. Haman is a bit crazy. Verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. Why? Well, because he's getting a supper with the queen and the king of Persia. But notice this. But when Haman saw Mordecai, Esther's cousin, adoptive father, in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And then Haman told them of the great riches, the multitudes of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. And tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Haman is stoked out of his mind. It says that he left joyous. He goes home and he tells his wife, honey, listen, I just got to eat dinner with the king. I'm telling my kids the riches that the king has blessed me with. On top of that, and he didn't invite anyone else but me, great and mighty Haman. How great I am and how amazing I am. And on top of that, I'm going back for dinner tomorrow. 2 nights in a row. I mean, that just shows that the king loves me. And yet, notice all of a sudden his joy is gone. It's instantaneously gone. Why? Because he saw Mordecai, and Mordecai didn't fear and tremble before him. And it tells us in verse 13 that avails me nothing. All of these great and amazing things avail me nothing as long as Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. I would have to say this. Haman was a self-absorbed man who had a false reality, because he didn't have true joy. His joy was based off of his circumstances. You see, Haman's problem wasn't Mordecai. It was the emptiness of his own heart. It's like the barn builder that Jesus talked about. When the barn builder was like, yeah, I've got all of these things. Let me build bigger barns to house more of my stuff. And And the Lord responded and said, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you. So is he who lays up treasures for himself is not rich towards God." Haman was poor and miserable because he allowed one little thing to take away all of his joy. Here he comes, so proud, like this proud peacock, just fluttering and showing his leaves, how great I am, how awesome I am. I'm on the cover of GQ and Forbes, and here I am just being the best that I can be. And then there's this little guy over here who doesn't fear me or tremble before me, and all my joy is gone. He's living on top of the world, but then all of a sudden he's in the pits. He's letting one person rob him of everything that he had. He had great power and prestige. I'll tell you this, I have been, and I know many of us have, been in a place and a point where we've allowed one person or one thing to rob us of all of our joy. To take away the blessings, to not see the good in the circumstances, to not see the good in the trials or the good in the waiting. I know personally on occasions I've allowed someone to take my joy, allowed this thing before me to envelop me, to make me lose sleep, to hurt, the frustration, the betrayal, the abandonment. And I'll say this, shame on us if we've allowed some little thing to take away our joy. Shame on us for being like Haman, from going from joyous to fury over one little thing. Over one little thing. I would say this, may God get a hold of us before we get to the point of Haman where we end up on a homicidal rampage, wanting to destroy people. We can't allow the circumstances that take place in our lives, the trials, those things to remove the joy we have in the Lord. The things that God has blessed us with. I mean, if we have our health, then praise be to God. If we have a roof over our head, then praise be to God. If we've got our children, praise be to God. I mean, there are moments, there are things that we can look at and say there is good in the midst of this. To not allow our lives and our hearts to be like Haman, where you go from being so joyful, yay, the king loves me. Oh, that guy won't bow down to me. That guy at work, that neighbor, that family member. What are they? And then you go to being in the dumps. Don't allow those things to take place. May God get a hold of our hearts before we end up like Haman, just bitter. And as we'll see, notice our next point, the fatal advice that Haman gets. He doesn't get good advice. He's in the dumps. He's mad because Mordecai the Jew is there sitting in the gates and he won't bow down to me. Everyone else loves me, but this one guy. And so verse 14, he gets this fatal advice. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet." And the thing pleased Haman so that he had the gallows made. He gets counsel from his wife and his friends. Hey, listen. Why don't you build a big giant execution machine in your front yard, 50 cubits high? How high is that? About 3 flagpoles, 75 feet, roughly. Why? So that everyone can see Mordecai the Jew dead there. And the Persians weren't really big on hanging people. It's not what they did. The gallows here isn't like an old Western hanging scene. What this is really the way that the Persians did things is they really impaled their victims on a stake. What ended up happening was the Phoenicians then came and they made it a little bit better. And then the Romans came and made it even 10 times, quote unquote, better, you could say, in regards to the execution of the cross. And so what we see here is a guy who, well, he's allowed the bitterness in his heart and in his life to make him value human life so little, to the point of wanting to humiliate and execute this man for simply not bowing down to him. And what we see here is that this guy, so filled with pride and self-absorbing hatred, outweighs the value of human life. I mean, he had so much going for him, didn't he? The king was blessing him. The queen was inviting him to dinner. I mean, he doesn't know what's going to happen here soon. But he had so much going for him, and all of a sudden he's allowing just this one little thing to destroy him. So much so that, I mean, he goes to bed. We'll see next week. He goes to bed sleeping well while they're building a gallows, a construction site in his front yard. And he's able to just saw logs like nothing because he wants this guy dead. Psalm 7 tells us this: "Behold, the wicked brings forth iniquity. Yes, he convinces troubles and brings forth falsehood. He made a pit and dug it out, and he will fall into the ditch in which he has made. His trouble shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down on his own crown." His wife says, "Well, maybe you should just kill the guy." And he's like, "Good idea, honey. Let's do this." Real Bonnie and Clyde-like moment. And what happens is Haman, being led by the flesh and so on, I mean, ends up in a bad place. And we'll see next week. We'll find out exactly what happens next week. But listen, as we close, a few things that I'd like to take from this morning's message and from chapter 5 as a whole, just specifically in dealing with waiting. Because we see Esther wait, fast, plan, and then put that plan into action, and we'll see that plan really carried out next week in this moment where they're going to have this a feast and this amazing thing take place where God works. But listen, as we jump into the closing points, sometimes we feel as if God is absent in our lives. We're waiting, but it's in the waiting that God is doing something. He's teaching and he's guiding and he's growing us. And so in looking at today, and I'm sure that there are many other things that we could take that we can learn in waiting, but for the time and for the message, I want to look at the 4 things we gain in waiting on the Lord. 4 things we gain in waiting on the Lord. Number 1, I mentioned the 4 things already, but number 1, we gain a better perspective. We gain a better perspective. Esther didn't act right away. She asked everyone to fast, and the implication is prayer as well. And then that time gave her to fast. That time that she fasted gave her an opportunity to think of how she was going to approach the king and deal with it. When we wait on the Lord, we gain a better and higher or heavenly perspective on what it is we're dealing with. Sometimes we want to just jump right into things, right? Something happens, something takes place, and we want to shoot off the email real quick. I'm gonna blah, blah. And how many of us have immediately regretted that email we've sent? Probably a lot of us. And so sometimes it's better to wait, to look at the situation, to gain a heavenly perspective so that we gain a better perspective on how to do things. Those who wait are those who work. They're working in the midst of their waiting. Just think about this. The farmer can wait all summer for his harvest to come, but guess what he's doing during that time? He's working. He's tilling. He's planting. He's watering. He's looking at things. He's checking the weather. He's going through and he's working in the midst of waiting for the harvest to come. And waiting is sometimes God's way to see if we're willing to trust him before we move forward. That trust is a patient trust. Whether it has to do with our relationships or our finances or our careers or our dreams or our churches, we have to trust that God knows what he is doing. And in the midst of that waiting, we can gain a better perspective. Number 2, we can gain extra energy. I know that seems weird. Like, wait, how is waiting gaining extra energy? Well, we can run spiritually and not get tired, but God supplies us in our time of need with extra energy. I'll tell you, there are moments where I've maybe taught on a Sunday morning, and physically I should be exhausted. I've worked all day Saturday in the yard or whatever at home, and then I come to church, and I should be tired. But man, sometimes after service I get this amazing second wind, this new amount of energy to be able to do another and to maybe do another. And sometimes people ask, what should I do while I'm waiting? And the good question is, well, in those moments of waiting, you take an active role like the watchman. The watchman in the Old Testament, Psalm 130 says, I wait for the Lord, my soul waits. I wait for Yahweh. I wait and put my hope in his word. I wait for the Lord more than a watchman for the mornings, more than a watchman for the mornings. The watchman was one that would wait overnight to make sure that the city gate and the city walls were protected. They couldn't speed up the process for dawn to come. They couldn't, just push the clock and I need it to be 6 a.m. I need the morning to come. No, but they waited. They couldn't speed it up, but they were waiting for that new day. And waiting reminds me that I'm not in charge, that I'm not God, which is always a good thing. It's always a good thing to be reminded you're not the Lord, right? That you're not God. Well, I want to fix my problems now. I want to fix my relationship now. I want to fix my conflicts now, my career now, my church now. And the reality is, you know what? I'm not the Lord. My job is to be a watchman, to have a watchman's attitude, to be confident, to be alert, to be aware. And what happens is realizing that I'm not the one in charge. I'm not the boss. The Lord is. It gives me new energy. Why? Because it helps me realize that I'm not the one that has to do it all. I don't have to do it all. I don't have to take matters into my own hands. It means the Lord will do it. Number 3, we gain an extra ability to persevere. We keep on walking without fainting. Then we wait on the Lord, and he enables us to endure. And Esther hasn't seen her husband in 30 days. The Lord directs the heart of the king, but at the same time, here's Esther waiting another 3 more days to get the process going, and it gives us an extra ability to persevere. It's like William Carey, the father of modern missions, didn't see a convert in India his first 7 years of ministry. Can you imagine? His first 7 years of ministry. And yet, as you wait on the Lord and as you trust in him, it gives you that extra ability to persevere, to keep on going. Well, I'm not in the position I want at my job yet. Well, you keep on going. Trust in the Lord. Lean into him. Wait on him. Maybe it's another 7 years. Well, we don't have kids yet. Well, maybe it's another 9 months. Well, we don't have... Wait. It will give you that extra moment, that extra that extra ability to persevere. Number 4, in waiting, we gain new strength. We become more men and women that are strong. Our strength is renewed. 2 Corinthians 12 talks about how the Lord meets our weakness with his strength. For the Christian, it's weird. We get stronger as we become weaker. We become richer as we become poorer. We get more elevated as we go down lower and more humble. God's economy is reversed. It's different. And we gain new strength. It's because Esther had waited that she was fully able and ready to enter the king's palace. She was fearless in that because she was prepared beforehand. The fasting and the waiting gave her strength. It gave her a plan. Isaiah 40. Those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. The time will come when those who wait on the Lord will soar. And as you wait, as you're watching, as you're a Weight Watcher, as you seek God, as you learn and grow in those moments, as the trials and the pressures and the times come, There's going to come a day where you're going to soar and God's going to work and move and use you, where you'll get promoted, where you'll see the fruit take place, where you'll see his hand and his blessing. And while sometimes it seems like he's silent, when those moments and those times of waiting are complete, you can look back in God's providence and see that he was working it out for his glory, for his good, for his pleasure, to make you that man and that woman that shines like a diamond. Let's pray. Heavenly Father,